So I'm going to record it to this computer and I'll upload it to Zoom after. So cool. All right. Well, we are at high noon, so welcome everybody. We've got a series of papers that were given by staff at the recent Mid-Atlantic Archaeology Conference back in March, which seems like a very long time ago now with everything that's been going on. But what we'll do is, I think, Chris, you're going to start out with the intro, and so Chris will come on up and begin things and give some context. But each of the papers are, we sent you all earlier a full set of the papers that you all can look at your leisure on the Google Drive. But everyone's gonna be given a 5-minute summary today. Yeah, yeah, and that one's muted as well, so we don't get we're not getting feedback. All right. Which one are you on, Chris? Chris. I'm giving Chris some control. Here we go. Co-host. Yeah, so you're co-host now, Chris. Okay, without further ado, here's Chris.
Thanks, Matt. Can you all hear me okay? I can't see anyone, so just someone say yes if you can.
Your head's cut off.
Ah, perfect.
Yes, all good.
Awesome. All right, so this is an abridged version of the session that we held at the conference, at the Mid-Atlantic Archaeology Conference earlier this March. Matt did share the link yesterday, and we'll share it again, the full papers that were presented. So if anyone's interest or piqued, we'll go there. So I'm just going to quickly do the intro paper here. Beginning in the late summer of 2019, the Montpelier Archaeology Department embarked on a comprehensive archaeological survey of the home farm as part of a multi-year collaborative research grant awarded by the NEH. The home farm is an approximately 70-acre space within which previous archaeological studies identified a hilltop site containing 3 enslaved quarters, known as the field quarters, and a nearby fire-curing tobacco barn and quarter with artifacts dating from the late 18th through 19th centuries. Documentation from 1844 also indicated the presence of an overseer's house and a mill within this area. This led to an initial hypothesis that this served as the center of farm operations from the 1790s through the 1840s, and thus the nomenclature of home farm or home quarter. However, throughout the current project, we have identified the archaeological remains of over a dozen sites, including domestic quarters of the enslaved, a blacksmith shop, a threshing barn, stables, an overseer's house complex, a farrier shop, tobacco barn sheds, and many other work areas. This area pictured here in this map encompasses a historic agricultural and industrial complex, once a bustling hub on the Montpelier plantation. Reportedly abandoned shortly after Dolly Madison sold the property in 1844, most of the study area has remained untouched by plowing or disturbance since that time. We previously discussed the results of investigations within the home farm during a lunch and learn in 2022, and we'll be sure to share that link as well. One of the sites within the home farm is the above mentioned overseer's house, which will be the primary focus of today. The structure and its approximate location appears on a plat drawn up when Dolly Madison sold the property to Henry Moncure in 1844. The house appears on another rendition of the map in 1848 when the property changed ownership again. Alteration to landscape features such as roads and streams occurred on that second rendition, so we have every reason to believe the structure still stood into the 1850s. However, accounts from the Civil War would suggest that the structure was no longer present by 1863. Mentions of overseers, named and unnamed, appear throughout the documentary record during the Madison period. Overseers were an economically and racially diverse group within 19th century plantation society, holding a middling place. Throughout Montpelier's long history, there were both free white and enslaved overseers whose scope of responsibility varied from specific farm tracts, projects and infrastructure, or overall plantation management. While there were likely a number of dwellings for overseers across Montpelier's thousands of acres, we believe that this site is the domicile of the head or principal overseer, a position that changed hands a dozen times throughout the Madison era. examining the lives of the overseers and their families living at this site, their role as managers of the plantation operations, and their relationships with both the Madisons and the enslaved community were the primary research objectives of the NEH Collaborative Research Grant. Examining the landscape of the home farm was the first component of this study, while conducting intensive excavations of the overseer's house site was the second. At the overseer's site, the primary objectives were to identify the overseer's home, surrounding yards, outbuildings, and activity areas. While overseers have been a consistent mention in the work of historians and archaeologists looking at plantation society, it is only recently that a comprehensive historical study of overseers has been conducted that addresses the ways that their participation in the institution of slavery and how it affected the daily life of the plantation identity of the overseer, their family, and the enslaved. Archaeology is well positioned to investigate these broader questions of identity as it relates to race, gender, and political status. We hope also that in addition to addressing the deficiencies in our understanding of overseers, this research will also bring forth a more nuanced and complex presentation of the early republic at Montpelier to our visitors by integrating another group of people who are often stereotyped in popular culture into the public interpretation. Inserting the complex layer of plantation middle management into the discussion of the relationship between the white elite Madisons and the enslaved community will hopefully provide even more opportunities for visitors and the community to think critically and thoughtfully about the past and its connections to the present. Work to date has consisted of phase 1 through 3 surveys since 2019. That included shovel test pits, ground penetrating radar, followed up with unit excavation to test what we had found in the phase 1, and then last year where we did intensive phase 3 excavations where we uncovered a wide number of features, including a borrow pit, a subfloor pit, a brick deposit, trenches, and several possible posts likely associated with the overseer's occupation. From the outset, as part of the overall research design of this project, we engaged in a collaborative research process with the ethical client, the MDC, and sought feedback from other community stakeholders, including you all, expeditioners, and more. Over the last few years, we have been compiling the questions asked by this larger community, which was written up in a report, and last fall we held a lunch and learn about some of these questions. Many amazing questions were posited that will help deepen our understanding of race and racialization at Montpelier and the lives of all those who lived and worked here. Answering these questions first requires a detailed archaeological analysis of the site and an assessment of the material and historical record. In order to more effectively answer the high-level interpretive questions raised through the clientage model and through civic engagement, we first aim to resolve basic archaeological questions, which will be addressed throughout the papers today. The abridged presentations of today cover various aspects of the site, including architectural materials, exploring the building's construction, ceramics, glass, and small finds, as well as looking at the building's broader place on the landscape, its yards, and a final paper that will seek to tie these data sets together to provide some possible interpretations of what is happening at the entire site. So that is the intro. I'm going to stop share briefly so I can pull up the next paper, which I believe is Miranda's. Let's see. Oh, right. So Miranda, who was did the archaeological internship last year, is now, oh, sorry, has kindly sent in a recording, and let me get to share screen again. Make this bigger, turn the quality. Well, we've got 360p quality, so we'll see what that's like. All right, I'm going to go ahead and play that.
Hello, my name is Brandon Claire, and my research is windows and doors to the past, architectural hardware, nails, and window glass at the Montpelier Overseer's house. Beginning with nails, a total of 6,729 were excavated at the Overseer's house site. Of these, 25% are hand-wrought and 43.44% are machine cut. The rest could not be definitively identified due to corrosion or being too small of a fragment. This distribution map of the total nails per unit reveals two clusters across the project site. By calculating the ratio of hand-wrought nails to total nails per unit, these clusters become distinct not only by location, but also by chronology. Hand-wrought nails are the earlier iteration of nails. concentrating in the same eastern edge of the project site where 18th century domestic artifacts suggest a possible enslaved border contemporaneous to Mount Pleasant, the first plantation established by the grandparents of President Madison and active from the 1720s to 1760s. This distribution map plot a ratio of machine-cut nails against total nails excavated per unit. It reveals a hotspot of machine-cut nails whose manufacturing process was introduced in the early 19th century, where we believe the overseer's house stood. By comparing the appearance of machine-cut nails and hand-wrought nails, there's an almost inverted relationship between where machine-cut nails are most clustered, the overseer's house, and where hand-wrought nails cluster, the Mount Pleasant era building. This confirms the hypothesis that the overseer's house was constructed in the 20th century. Finally, by comparing the average nail count per unit at the overseer's house to other archaeological sites in Montpelier, we get an idea of the structure's construction. With an average of 79.16 nails per unit, the nail frequency closely resembles that of timber frame structures in the South Yard. For example, the stable quarter in green has an average of 81.7 nails per unit. Next, window glass. In total, 1,077 individual pieces of window glass weighing 13.83 ounces were excavated in the overseer's house project. For analysis, I grouped these into dominant color categories based on the Montpelier Tech collection. Aqua window glass represents the majority color classification, comprising 65% of the total weight of the assemblage. Blue follows as the second largest group, then colorless and green. Window glass hotspots appear in the same general area as nails. The reed unit at the eastern edge contributed a significant 16% of the total weight of the window glass assemblage. Notably, no blue window glass is present in these units and concentrates entirely around the overseer's house. Now, let's look at other archaeological sites at Montpelier. In the South Yard, built around 1810, blue window glass is the second largest weight. However, in the 18th century Northwest Yard, it is once again absent. This analysis demonstrates that blue window glass is associated with 19th century construction on Montpelier, and the overseer's house is likely contemporaneous to the construction of South Yard during James Madison's presidency and retirement period of 1810 to 1836. Finally, architectural hardware. 3 artifacts provide evidence of at least one door lock at the overseer's house. These artifacts, 2 deadbolts and 1 lock keeper, are components of an iron rim lock, the most common lock in use from the 17th to 19th centuries. The next artifact of significance is a copper plated key. The copper plating indicates that the key is of a higher quality. The shoulder is behind the complete T, which indicates it corresponds to a complete stop lock or a rim lock. The big question is, what did this key do? One possibility, given its fancier nature, is that the key corresponds to a lock at the main house. For example, Thomas Jefferson charged the overseer at public force with keeping keys. However, Dolly Madison was known to be responsible for these keys. In describing her 1835 visit to Montpelier, British abolitionist Harriet Montanel writes, "During all our conversations, one or another slave was perpetually coming to Madison for the great bunch of keys." Furthermore, Madison evidently had a preference for interior mortise locks over the exterior rim stop locks if this key was locked. In a 1798 letter where Madison orders door locks and hinges for Thomas Jefferson, he states that if 3 doors are too thin for mortise locks, the alternative would be exterior brass rim locks. So, while the main house likely did have brass rim locks, an overseer at Montpelier was more likely responsible for barns, rations, and equipment. Historical accounts compiled by Laura R. Sandy in the Overseers of Early American Slavery describes incidents where George Washington, David Carter, and Joseph Ball, all planters, wrote explicit directions to overseers to tighten security over keys to food, crops, and agricultural tools after incidents of embezzlement. This power to control access to material needs, such as clothing, food, and tools, posits the overseer as a regulator of enslaved labor and a first responder to resistance. Furthermore, Paul Jennings, the enslaved body servant of James Madison, writes that he never knew Mr. Madison to strike a slave. Neither would he allow an overseer to do it whenever any slaves were reported to him as stealing or cutting a pack. This quote evidences and psychiatric visuals define bondage at Montpelier, as well as the nuanced relationship of behavioral monitoring between overseers, planters, and the enslaved. As such, locks and keys became a tool for which overseers and the enslaved community constantly negotiated agency and punishment. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the incredible team at Montpelier for their support during my research.
All right, that was awesome. And next up, we have Corey Rowell presenting what makes a house a home. Get it up real quick. Okay. Hello, my name is Corey Rowell, and this is a brief summarization of my research project, What Makes a House a Home, an analysis of masonry materials from Montpelier's Overseer's House expedition or excavation. See, the intention of this research was to narrow down where the Overseer's house was built, the form of the dwelling, and the materials of its construction. So from historical maps and texts, we know that the previous Overseer's house was at the Mount Pleasant site in the 1790s, and that the next time the new one is mentioned, since the other one burned in a fire, I believe, is in an 1844 property map. This meaning that the Overseer's house that we'll be talking about today is presumed to have been built sometime within that 50-year gap in the records. From that general location on the map, our metal detecting survey further narrowed down the potential area by revealing a spot with a high concentration of metal hits right in the center. And this is a pretty good indicator of there being a possible structure, given all the nails that were there. Overall, the amount of brick found at the Overseer site is proportionally greater than any of the other sites within the Home Farm Project area. These other sites including the blacksmith, tobacco barn, and field quarters. And none of those were determined to have brick foundations or brick chimneys. Here's an example of what foundations in a chimney would look like for context. So it'd be fairly obvious. During excavation, we hypothesized that the high concentration of brick at the Overseer's house could potentially be the remains of a chimney fall or a hearth, with the plowing that occurred in this area having further broken and scattering those remains or remnants. What becomes interesting is when you take a look at the distributions for window glass as a comparison to the brick, where the brick distribution shows a hot spot in the area to the right of the proposed house location. There's a noticeable cold spot for the window glass. This led us to believe, or to the possibility that if there was indeed a chimney on that side of the house, then it would stand to reason that it would be unlikely for there to be any windows adorning the same wall. And we can see this trend continue in other comparable buildings on the Montpelier property, such as the Staple Quarter. See, here we have the primary trend feature at the Overseer's site. The hypotheses formed for this one ranged from being a robbed out brick foundation, a buried sill, or possibly simply a drainage trench. In the portions that were bisected and excavated, there was not a significant amount of brick fragments or even flecks. Instead, there were some larger ceramic fragments, small ash deposits, and charred wood. These trench features could indicate the boundaries of the structure. Right next to the Overseer's site trench, there was a small potential pier, though its location within the proposed interior of the building is unusual. That could still lend to the idea of the structure being a log or timber framed. A subfloor pit believed to be within the Overseer's house was also bisected and partially excavated. Subfloor pits are typically found within structures, which is another reason why we theorize this to be the location of the house, though there are always exceptions. The subfloor pit could also indicate that there's a hearth nearby because it was filled with ash and burnt artifacts such as like eggshells and ceramics. Our current hypothesis as to the form of the overseer's house is that it was a gable-ended building with a log chimney on the eastern side and a stick and mud flue, much like the one in this image. There wasn't enough evidence to say that there were brick foundations or a brick chimney. Instead, to account for what brick is present, we theorized that the brick could have been used to line the hearth, the firebox, and smoke chamber. Since we can rule out that this wasn't a brick building, just because we don't have the amount of brick that would be needed for that, we can reasonably assume that it was a log or timber framed structure. Yeah. So further research and excavation will be needed to be done on the overseer site in order to get a better understanding of what exactly we're starting to see there. But for now, this is laying the foundation for what we need to do in the future. Thank you.
I hope everyone picked up on that clever laying the foundation joke. Good job, Corey. All right, stop share briefly so I can get the next paper pulled up. Similar to Miranda, Alyssa Baker did the internship last year and is now doing CRM out west, and again, kindly shared a recording. Why is this not open? 1080p, fancy. Right.
Hi everyone, my name is Alyssa Baker and I was an archaeology intern at Montclair this last year. I will be presenting hopefully an abbreviated version of my research that I presented for the Mid-Atlantic Archaeology Conference, talking about the grit analysis at the overseer's house. A grit analysis and how is it useful? A grit analysis is useful for identifying the spaces around the overseer's house, such as swept yards, other structures, possibly outside cooking or meal prepping areas, and other yard activities. Now, one of the important questions, what is grit? Grit is recovered from water screen samples. For those who have come on the expeditions or the field school before, the water screen samples would have been collected in the yellow canvas bags from each soil layer. The grit is basically everything and anything left over from the water screening process. This includes a variety of stones, bricks, and artifacts. The grit does get sorted at the lab into different size categories as shown in the photo. Before we get too far into the grit analysis, I would like to quickly go over plowing at the overseer's house. The overseer's house was plowed over several times, and as such, I needed to research the effects of plowing on the site. I found that the vertical placement of features and artifacts is destroyed during plowing as it mixes the soil together, but learned that artifacts will stay in their approximate location and should be found near their original locations. Larger objects are also more likely to be displaced further as they could easily be caught and dragged by the plow. Here are some of my resources on the effects of plowing that I mentioned in the previous slide. Next up is grit analysis and interpretation. One of the main research goals was to determine the possibility of a swept yard near the overseer's house. The circle area here on this map is an area of interest for a possible location of a swept yard. The map here shows all the grit found that was greater than a ½ inch, which does include stone and brick. The amount of grit here is higher than the surrounding areas. The grit distribution does continue at the 1/4 inch level. As you can see here, we do still continue to have a greater amount of grit in that same area as the 1/2 inch. And we also do see this reflected again on the 1/8 inch map, although to a lesser extent than the 1/2 and 1/4 inch. Now, typically swept yards are identified by significant lack of grit and artifacts compared to their surroundings. Due to the fact that this area was disturbed by fouling and had a possible chimney fall, I hypothesized that the grit data of this area may be skewed by the brick fragments found here. This was something that was noticed even during fieldwork, as we often refer to it as the brick area due to the increase of brick and the noticeable lack of other artifacts. The maps that I'm showing here show the comparison of grit and bricks at the 1/2 inch level. The brick map is specifically only showing the brick found in the 1/2 inch grit data and excludes all other grit such as stones. The brick maps show the distribution of brick across the whole site, with it more densely concentrated around our area of interest. Now, the next few maps were created by removing the bricks from our grit data and were separated into 3 categories showing greenstone, quartz, and other stone distributions. This map here shows the greenstone distribution at the 1/2 inch level, which shows a significant lack of greenstone in our area of interest. This is again reflected on the quartz map as shown here, and is also reflected on the other stones map as shown in this slide. Next, we'll be looking at our artifact distributions within our area of interest. I separated the artifacts into 4 categories, which were nails, window glass, ceramics, and animal bone. These categories were used as these artifacts were found across the entirety of the overseer's site, and therefore would provide the most data of artifact concentrations. The map here shows a lack of nails in our area of interest. The map on this slide shows a lower concentration of window glass in our area of interest. We then see a lower concentration of ceramic artifacts on this map. And on our last artifact map, we see a lower concentration of animal bone within our area of interest. Now, taking the data that we've seen from our grit and artifact distributions shows that there is a strong likelihood of a swept yard in this area. Thank you to everyone for tuning in today to hear our presentations. While this was a very abbreviated version of the research done, I hope it answered some questions on how people interacted with the space around the overseer's house. Also, if anyone is interested, the very last slide shows a few other areas of interest around the overseer's house, such as other possible structures and work areas that would benefit from more research.
All right, next up, we are going to have Alexander Mishnik presenting his paper on ceramics. Take it away, Alex.
Hey everyone, my name's Alex. I'm an archaeology technician here with Montpelier, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we found out about the ceramics. Ceramic analysis of the overseer's house revealed a distinct chronological divide between site occupations relating to the 18th and 19th centuries. It also allowed us to notice several decoration trends associated with other sites of Montpelier, like the South Yard complex and the field quarter of the home farm. Seen here is the overall site ceramic distribution. Additionally, this analysis assisted in determining the quantities of ceramic function varieties, like tableware and utilitarian vessels, and how those are deposited across the site. These maps indicate utilitarian wares and tablewares regardless of time period. Much of the earlier ceramic varieties from the 18th century were found toward the eastern portion of the site. These included white salt glazed stoneware, Rhenish stoneware, molded black basalt, creamware, and tin glazed earthenware like Delft, just to name a few. And here's a couple distribution maps we made showing tin glazed earthenware and white salt glazed stoneware. And if you're curious about what those might look like, we've got a couple photos of sherds right here. Now, toward the western portion of the site was the greatest concentration of ceramic artifacts. 19th century ceramics like pearlware, whiteware, and transfer print decorated sherds appear closely associated with the mass deposition here. And creamware, which is seen on the left, actually, I'm going to jump back just a second, is perhaps the most interesting and most chronologically prevailing ceramic variety present at the site. Creamwares are distributed near, but not necessarily within the body of 19th century deposition. Creamware deposits concentrate to the south and north of the area believed to be associated with the 19th century structural area and seem to transpose themselves among a mass of various tableware deposits. Creamware does have an elongated overlap between the 18th and 19th centuries production-wise, so circa 1762 up until the 1830s. And lighter colored creamware especially was in regular production throughout the first third of the 1800s. The result of the chronological queries across the entire assemblage was the mean ceramic date determined to be about 1816. And if I'm going to show you here, this is just some of the other types that overlap between the 18th and 19th century and how those are kind of distributed. So what you have here is like, as you move forward in time, everything kind of shifts westward in terms of like chronological deposition, as well as some of the types that we looked at that overlap between the 18th and 19th centuries. And as you can see on that far left bar there, the lighter yellow creamware that we identified really just kind of dominates that portion of the assemblage. Within our excavation efforts later in the season, we were able to investigate several feature deposits like possible trenches, a large borrow pit, and a subfloor pit. The first that I want to point out in this particular feature is this broad brushstroke blue and green teacup. So it's a polychrome is what we call it. It's basically multiple different colors, mostly intact and upside down in situ near the bottom of the trench feature fill. And the second pattern that I want to point out is a number of hand-painted sherds that contained a really cool star pattern. And that's our other technician, Mac, excavating the subfloor pit feature. And these hand-painted wares range from brown colored to like a yellow and brown polychrome. And then they have multiple star figures present in the vessel body. Seen here, these two sherds and several others were recovered from the subfloor pit. And aside from the subfloor pit from this past season, this star pattern is actually observable from other areas of Montpelier, like the Northwest Yard Complex, an area of residence and labor nearby the Madison household that would have been inhabited by domestic enslaved individuals. It also appears in the assemblage from the field quarter site, a cluster of 3 structures that housed enslaved individuals in the home farm area of Montpelier. Suffice to say, this particular decorative motif is one of some popularity and meaning to the point of its distribution across several Montpelier sites, and potentially more. Further analysis will present more refined discussion, considering the assemblage's vessel forms, as well as possible comparative study with similar sites in the Chesapeake Lake Monticello, Belgrove Plantation in the northern Shenandoah Valley, and others. In turn, we would also like to begin to engage site occupation on an even smaller level, looking at various transfer print and hand-painted decorations to correlate date ranges with the inhabitation of individual overseers. This initial analysis, however, succeeded in pinpointing several trends in this regard with prominent decorative types. It also managed to identify 18th and 19th century deposition patterns that will be very important to the continued study of the collection moving forward. With that said, the work on the Overseer's House ceramic assemblage is only just beginning, so stay tuned.
Nice job, Alex. Thank you for sharing about ceramics. Next up is going to be Matt Guthrie, who is going to present on small finds recovered from the site. And that one was also recorded. So I'm going to open that. This is actually Mac's last week here, so we're all very sad about that. Yes, thank you. Great.
everyone. My name is Matt Guthrie. I'm one of the archaeological technicians here at Montpelier, and my research from the Mid-Atlantic Archaeological Conference centered on the small finds found from the overseas house. So first, what are small finds? Here at Montpelier, we define them as small and sexy artifacts of any material type that are majorly made up of personal items. So this includes a lot of different artifact categories, but for this project itself, I mostly focused on personal adornment, clothing, sewing equipment, smoking items, and leisure items in particular. So first, we're going to start with clothing and adornment. The artifacts that you see on your screen are a drawn bead, a copper alloy buckle, a copper alloy breechcloth, and a eye closure from a hook and eye. As you can see from the graph, we found a lot of buttons. So we also found a lot of different types of buttons. Most of them were copper alloy, but interestingly, we found 6 glass buttons, which you can see on your screen. These buttons were actually paste gems. So paste gems are an affordable alternative to gemstones that are worn by all classes. Many of them, or at least a few of them, have a star pattern, including the copper alloy button you see below that, which is interesting, and a pattern that we saw repeated in other types of artifacts from this site, which you may be hearing about in a different presentation. So as you can see from this GIS distribution map that Christopher Cash helped me with, you can see that it was densest around where we think that the overseer's house was based on what we found archaeologically, which is interesting. And then going into sewing equipment. For sewing equipment, I mostly just looked at straight pins, safety pins, and thimbles. As you can see, there wasn't a lot of artifacts for me to work with, but this research did get me really interested in straight pins. So if you want to hear more about straight pins and their possible usage and how to date using straight pins, please let me know, but I don't have time to go into it now. We can also tell a lot of different things about the thimbles and what they're made of and what social classes and sizing based on that. But unfortunately, again, I didn't have a lot of data to work with there. We also had some writing-related artifacts. We had 3 writing slates and 11 slate pencils. As you can see on your screen, there's an example of a slate pencil and a writing slate with writing on it that we found at overseas house. As you can see from this GIS distribution map, they kind of outline where the structure might have been. And there was an interesting concentration up in the northeast, which might have something to do with 18th century occupation prior to this overseas house. But that's just a hypothesis. And then in my leisure category of artifacts, I had toys and musical equipment. So we had 3 toys, marbles, one of which you can see above the graph or the chart. And then we have a jaw harp pictured as well, and that was the one musical instrument we found. Something that I was really interested in for this project was our smoking related finds. Also, I had more data to work with here, which is really nice. You can see how we had 38 pipe bowls, 141 pipe stems, and then 20 that had fragments that had both bowl and stem attached. Most of them were white clay. You can see some examples pictured there on your screen. So for this distribution map, again, where the rectangle is and where we think the structure is, you can see that it doesn't seem like there was a lot of pipes near where we think the structure is. That's where it is lightest, so that means that's where it is the least amount. And where it's darkest is where you had the most amount. But you can see it's an interesting concentration over here, over where it's circled, and there is a yellow circle. The yellow circle is where there was a well that we found, not as part of the home core project, but as previous excavations found. And also interesting from this point where this well is also a high point elevation-wise. And right here from this picture, you can see what the view is from that high spot of elevation. You can see it is a very nice view of what we call the view quarters, which is interesting if you think about
why there might be a concentration of pipes there, maybe standing there smoking. There's a lot of really interesting inferences that can be made there. But in conclusion, there's so many cool things going on at the small finds here that unfortunately I don't have the time to get into, but I'm more than willing to talk to anyone about it any time. And I'll probably love to do more future research about this. But yeah, thank you so much for listening.
All right, great job, Mac. Next up, we have Stephen Billy presenting his paper on star motifs. Get that up. Take it away, Steve.
Oops, sorry.
During excavations at the Overseer site, we encountered numerous artifacts, but in particular noted the recurring appearance of artifacts that contained either star or star-like decorative motifs. We were able to determine that these items appeared with at least twice the frequency as any other site excavated at Montpelier. This raised questions about whether the presence of these particular motifs in the assemblage could provide additional information about the people who lived and worked at the site, whether it be their personal decorative preferences, affiliations, or ideological beliefs. Perhaps the best place to start is to provide examples of some of the star motifs we found. 2 pearlware ceramic shirts. A copper button with 6 connected 6-pointed stars. A copper alloy button with a single 6-pointed star. A blue paste gem with 6-pointed star set within appears to be a flower design. A brass medallion-like object with an 8-pointed debossed sunburst motif, possibly a snuff box lid. A copper alloy button with a central flower or star-like motif. A blue paste gem from a mold that created a star-like faceted pattern. A light blue paste gem shaped similarly to a brilliant cut diamond, a style that was popular in the 18th century. A dark blue paste gem molded into an intricate floral and 6-pointed star design. An 1838 cornet head large cent that contained a pattern of 13 6-pointed stars surrounding the head of Lady Liberty. In working to determine the reason for the presence of these artifacts in the assemblage, we first looked to establish whether or not we could create a precise timeline. Unfortunately, some of the artifacts outlined above are not easily datable. Now we can turn to the question of whose items might these be. There are 3 primary groups that might be responsible for the deposits at the Overseer site: the Madison family, the Overseers, and the enslaved. We'll discuss each of these in order. First is the Madison family. When the Madison family first came to the property in 1732, they built their initial homestead named at Mount Pleasant. That location is approximately 200 feet northeast of the Overseer site. The Mount Pleasant site has largely been excavated, and we do not believe that a substantial number of objects from the main house at Mount Pleasant have made it to the Overseer site. In 1764, the Madison family moved from Mount Pleasant to the main house, which is 3/10 of a mile to the east of the Overseer site. Accordingly, it is doubtful the Madison family contributed to the assemblage of the Overseer site in any statistically significant way. The second group is the principal overseers themselves. Identifying the principal overseers has been difficult for a number of reasons. First and foremost, most of the farm records from Montpelier were destroyed after Madison's death. Accordingly, the identity of the overseers must sometimes be pieced together by external documents. Second, there were times when the overseer was mentioned in the records but was not clearly identified by name. Once we have fully determined the identity of the overseers and have conducted research on their histories and genealogies, we will need to see if it provides any obvious insights into why there are so many star motifs found in the assemblage. For example, were star symbols utilized by any of the overseers' families as part of their family crest or family symbol? Were any of the overseers members of groups, either religious, social, or fraternal, that would explain the presence of star decorative motifs on the site? One possible example of this would be membership in the Freemasons. We know the Freemasons used star symbols, were very active at this time, and that they had a large presence in the central Virginia area, including Masonic Lodge in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Another possible concept we have considered is the possibility that one or more of the overseers could have been veterans of either the Revolutionary War and or the War of 1812. It could be that an individual that lived at the overseer site identified with the military and or valued these concepts, and the star motif was symbolic of the concept. It is also likely that the enslaved population was present, and at times the overseer site would have been at least partially black space. Patricia Sanford of Jefferson Patterson Park's Mac Lab has written about possible relationships between enslaved individuals and star imagery on objects. Dr. Sanford discussed a number of possible sources of symbolism, but I addressed three for purposes of the paper. First, the idea that stars could be symbolic of the North Star and thus represented the possibility of physical freedom, since that constellation could be utilized to help individuals seeking to escape the bonds of enslavement and find their way north towards freedom. A second idea she mentioned is that stars have been interpreted as possibly being represented the African god folklore figure Anansi. This is one of the symbols for Anansi. It's believed in some of the cultures which form the African diaspora that Anansi symbolized the value of being cunning and or demonstrating self-reliance. The third idea is stars as concepts of freedom and liberty. It seems likely that the enslaved community was aware of emerging symbols of patriotism and would have been aware that symbols such as the star stood in part for concepts including freedom. Although that may have been political freedom and intellectual freedom to white individuals, it is certainly possible the star came to symbolize either that and or actual physical freedom to enslaved individuals. Finally, in analyzing the presence of star motifs, we cannot rule out the possibility they're merely a reflection of personal choice separate from any ideological meaning. Perhaps an individual living at the overseer site simply liked the way stars looked as a decorative motif, or perhaps they treasured imagery of the night sky. Every human being is unique, and our individual preferences can be shaped by our unique experience and tastes. Perhaps the presence of stars is the result of decorative trends or fashion trends during the period. Perhaps choices of goods for those that lived at the site were limited based on limited access to markets. It can also be all of the above. Cultural trends may lead to the prevalence of these symbols and availability on the market, but the individual meaning attributed to them by individuals purchasing and utilizing the objects may align or differ greatly from the intended meanings present in the larger cultural trends. There were several other possible interpretations and substantially more analysis listed in the full paper, which has been made available if you're interested in learning more about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve and Billy, for presenting that. I don't know if I'm still sharing. All right, next up is Gabby, who presents on faunal remains and other foodways. Get that up. It is not a recording. All right, well, Gabby.
Hello, my name is Gabriela Bombino. It's a quick look into my research project. The production, preparation, and consumption of food are all largely social processes which are often reflective of one's means as well as an expression of agency within an oppressive system. Research conducted based on data from documentary records and past excavations here at Montpelier have provided insights into the foodways of the Madison household and that of the enslaved community. Previous research found that culinary practices were heavily influenced by socioeconomic status, trends, social activities, and desires for dietary diversity. The goals of this research are to gain an understanding of dietary practices in the overseer's household through preliminary analysis of recovered faunal remains, as well as to compare these findings to those from contexts associated with Madison's and the enslaved community's households. This will contribute towards further developing an understanding of the overseer's social identity relations and interaction with those groups. So starting out, there were a few challenges encountered throughout this process. The overseer's site has been plowed, and as a result, much of the bone has been broken down into small pieces. On the slides, a picture of the faunal cataloging process, and you can see how many of the bone and shell pieces are small and degraded. This causes many levels of taxonomic identification, such as determining species of individual fragments, to be difficult and sometimes impossible. As a result, the level of detail for potential analysis, such as looking at specific cuts of meat as part of the overseer's diet, is limited. There are various stages at which faunal material was collected and recorded. Collection occurred while screening in the field, as well as water screening in the lab. Identifiable fragments could be found even at the small scale during gradient sorting and picking. Some such finds including small rodent jaws, eggshell, and fish vertebra. There are also larger, more delicate fragments of bone recovered visually from the top of strata, as shown in the photo, in order to protect them from damage during excavation. On this slide is a chart of overall counts for faunal material. These cover broader ranges of taxonomic categories, as once again, much of it cannot be further categorized. The largest category is mammal bone, and the identified fraction of which is mostly made up of cow and pig bone. Of the shell collected, most were oyster. This is a distribution map of all the bone recovered at the overseer site. The area of high concentration on the northwest section of the central block of units is directly over the borrow pit. The other area of high concentration is on the far northeast end of the central block of the units, offset from what we have hypothesized maybe a potential swept yard or hearth area. Among the various categories of conditions that we take note of is determining whether bone is burnt or partially burnt as a potential indicator of cooking. Burnt bone will often be a stark white color rather than an off-white color, as much of our other bone is. Looking at the distribution of burnt bone, we can see the areas of highest concentration follow a very similar pattern to that of the overall bone distribution. Cut bone is often identified by clean slices through or on the bone, a remnant of the butchery process. This map symbolizes locations where cut bone was recovered over the general bone distribution map, with concentrations of them being largely found in the borrow pit area. This pattern, in conjunction with that of the burnt bone, suggests the possibility of these areas as being sites of refuse or potentially cooking and preparation of food. Teeth are an important category of bone to look at, as they can be strong indicators of species of animal. Looking at the teeth, we can gather an idea of what the makeup of the species consumed were like. With the general category of mammal bone identified, the majority of identified teeth were pig and cow teeth, with some sheep teeth as well. The majority of teeth identified were molars, which is helpful. As far as shell goes, clam and oyster shell were largely concentrated in the borrow pit area as well, in the easternmost section of the site, possibly associated with earlier occupation ranging in the 18th century. The presence of shell can potentially indicate importation of food due to the distance from larger bodies of water. And future research can include analysis of ceramic vessels and bottles for insight on a broader range of dietary practices, for example, consumption of alcohol. Processing of pollen samples for floral analysis can give insight to which plants were being grown in the area and if they were contributing to diet, as well as determining the ratio of wild to domesticated plants. A more detailed level taxonomic classification will allow for analysis of cuts of meat, comparing the ratio of livestock consumption versus wild game being consumed. All of these findings could then be compared to those from the context of the Madison's household and the enslaved households, investigating how diets were influenced by each other's practices and how expressions of agency were made through food waste. Thank you.
Great job, Gabby. Next up, we have a recording from Cairo Harrell, one of our lab interns from last year.
Hi everyone, my name is Kyra Harrell and I will talk about the economic relationship between enslaved blacksmith and overseers on James Madison Montpelier plantation. The overseer's house site is located on a hill that has an elevated view of the entire home farm. It's also directly next to Mount Pleasant and the Westgate Road. In 1801, former President James Madison Jr. inherited the property and all the people enslaved on the plantation. 1790 to 1844 are the years that I'll be focusing on. I will also be comparing the overseer's house site to the blacksmith shop, the farrier's shop, a bit of the main house in South Yard as well, because potentially these locations show the most economic change. The blacksmith shop has always been profitable, so why did Madison Jr. downsize a highly profitable farm? And why was it moved to the home farm? In 1790, plans for the main house restoration and adding the creation of temple to the landscape were in development. The removal of the blacksmith shop from the temple to the home farm can be based on aesthetics of the property to show financial wealth and reputation. But the hypothesis I find more interesting is Gabriel's rebellion in 1801. He was a blacksmith who orchestrated a rebellion against Thomas Jefferson in Richmond, Virginia. The blacksmith shop was moved in 1809. The enslaved population was not living in a traditional family, and many homes were arranged in the hopes of breeding new enslaved children. Families living in separate locations on property were only able to see each other in passing on Sundays, holidays, or late at night without groups. The move from the temple to the home farm could be considered a passive by the Madison to the enslaved community. rebel, and I can move it even further away. Madison had the enslaved population working 6 days a week from dawn to dusk to rebuild the rebel. Through the Montpelier naming projects, there are 2 blacksmiths that we have names for. Moses in 1779, he was the head blacksmith, overseer, and featuring several other blacksmiths as well. After Madison Sr.'s death in 1801, he was purchased by Madison Jr. for $682. Willoughby was another blacksmith in 1784. He was literate. He kept the blacksmith shop ledger. He often collected payments and materials, and he was one of the 50 deeded to John Todd by John Paxton. He was valued for $100. In 1817, Madison retired from presidency and was in a financial downfall. He relied on mixed agriculture to gain more income, to pay for renovations of the main house and for the lavish parties he was having, for expensive material goods, and then increasing debt for their son, John Todd. So to gain more income, they decided to sell the Over a 17-year period, land was being sold every 1 to 2 years. So that's over 2,000 acres of land being sold for $34,000. When selling land wasn't enough, the Madisons relied on the next big commodity on the plantation, and that was selling slaves. The 2017 Montpelier Slavery Interpretation Manual shows that from 1782 1840, there was a natural increase of people due to the forced breeding. In 1844, enslaved people were being sold off without debt. In 1852, due to John Pig's Todd increasing debt. So, who were the overseers? Some of the names we do know, we have identified, but some of the overseers' names we do not know. What were the role of the overseers? I hypothesize that the role of the overseer in 1809 was to surveil, giving the overseer more control over the movements and behaviors of all those who lived. The rise of self-sufficiency of skilled artisans became more prominent and was a necessity to maintain. These distribution maps show the evidence to support blacksmithing by the amount of slag found at the blacksmith and for each site. Each location had over 836 ounces of slag. We just need to know the purpose, the quantity, the quality, and the materials coming from each site. So by comparing the artifacts found at the overseer site, we see more common goods than compared to artifacts found at the barrier site. There are a lot more abundance of slag, and we see more skilled artists here. When we get to the blacksmith site, we see even more advanced production and repair by the locks and other tools that we found. So, in conclusion, my hypothesis is that the overseer's purpose was to survey skilled artists. In a time of self-sufficiency, blacksmiths played a crucial role in the economic development of the plantation, and they needed to be. And thank you so much for joining my presentation. If you have any more questions, you're more than welcome to email me or feel free to access my document anytime. Thank you.
Awesome. You're watching us, Cairo. Great job. Thank you. All right, stopping share. Next up is Liz McKay, our lab director, who is going to present on, get to the right folder here. Horse-related artifacts, equestrian-related artifacts within the home farm and Montpelier more generally as part of her dissertation research. Got to share screen first. I keep forgetting. And give you Liz.
Hi, everyone. I will be talking about horseshoes today. So we have recovered close to 600 horseshoes from across the property. While my larger dissertation will look at the majority of these artifacts, this paper focuses on the smallest subset of the data, looking at a mere 13 horseshoes recovered from the home farm and overseer's site. Now, 13 is admittedly not the best sample size to perform this kind of study, but you'll note on this point plot map that horseshoes from the home farm are most frequently occurring at the farrier and blacksmith-related sites. We also see that horseshoes seem to be recovered along road systems, which is pretty unsurprising. The horseshoe has four main parts. The two arms that make up the sides of the horseshoe are referred to as the branches, while the top of the shoe is the toe, and the two projections at the bottom are referred to as the heels. Horseshoes must have nail holes to attach the shoe to the horse's hoof. Some nail holes are placed along an indented groove along the branches known as fullering. Fullering is not a requirement for a shoe, however, and many horseshoes have nail holes without this indication. There are special modifications to shoes that can be present on the toe known as toe clips. These are added to secure the shoe to the hoof and treat medical conditions like cracked hooves. Modifications to the shoes can also be present on the heels. If the shoe has an outward projection at the heel, this is referred to as a calkin. Calkins provide extra traction and support for the horse. Before I set out on my horseshoe analysis, I did a lot of research on farrier practices, the anatomy of the horse's hoof and leg, and the craftsmanship behind horseshoeing. Horses' hooves are similar to human fingernails in that they grow rapidly and they need frequent maintenance, to the point that they need a farrier to attend to their feet, trimming and reshoeing about once every 3 to 6 weeks, even if the horseshoe is not worn out. That really struck me because it's an enormous amount of labor and maintenance required for one's primary source of transportation, agricultural machine, sporting animal, and status symbol. Further, I began to read accounts of farriers and blacksmiths. These accounts showcase the immense skill and knowledge of horse anatomy required to shoe a horse. The farrier or smith had to consider the anatomy of the horse. Does the horse have a conformation that is built uphill or downhill? And do its shoes need to be built in kind to correct conformation defects? In the full paper, I go through each of the categories listed in this slide, highlighting nuances of each category and some findings from each one. I don't have time to get into all of these today, but essentially they all tell us a little bit more about the horse's anatomy and conformation from each characteristic. So now I'm going to speed forward and jump into the results. Here are the horseshoes in question from across the home farm and overseer site. As you can see, some are quite fragmented, so not a ton of information was able to be gained from these. Of the 6 half shoes that we recovered from the home farm, 3 out of 6 likely had 6 nail holes total. Archaeologist Ivor Noel Hume suggests that we'd see up to 10 nail holes per branch, or half a shoe, by the 18th century, which seems extreme when we look at what we recover at Montpelier, where shoes have as few as 1 nail hole per branch and as many as 4. I'll be interested to see further nail hole analysis on the 500 plus shoes across the property to see if we can see distinct patterns with a bigger sample size. As for the presence of calkins and fullering, I found that calkins were present on 6 out of 10 shoes where heels were present, indicating a possible trend towards shoeing of all 4 feet or modifying the shoes, and a pretty even split as to whether the horseshoe nails were nailed into a fullered shoe to prevent wear down of the nail or not. Though this is admittedly a very small study of horseshoes from the home farm, and it did not necessarily change our interpretation of the plantation landscape, I think the potential is there with a larger sample size to be able to parse out trends in farrier practices across the plantation. And from this small sample size alone, there was considerable variety. This variety, along with high quantities of these horseshoes across the plantation, showcased the amount of labor and expertise needed to perform quite regular and individualized veterinary care on plantation equines. At a site like the home farm at Montpelier, this could mean close to 180 shoes a month for those owned by Madison, not to mention the visiting horses shod at the farrier shop. I also wrote this paper as a general call to action for the sake of horseshoe analysis, to keep talking about the variations we see in using these objects to tell a story of expertise and veterinary care. Moving forward, we'll be recording more and more in the analysis process as we come to better understand what data on horseshoes can tell us. I'd also like to look further into the creation of horseshoes on plantation sites in the region a bit more. So if anyone has any leads on this, please, please, please let me know. And thank you for your time. Next up, we're gonna have Chris Pash close us out with let me stop sharing, with his paper, our paper on the Summary and results of the overseer's house excavation. Take it away, Chris.
Awesome. So just as a quick thank you to you all, we do recognize that it's past an hour, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. The paper was already over time at the conference itself, so definitely take some time to read that. But just to start, this paper was written up and presented by myself, Liz, Matt, Terry Brock, and Stephen Billy, but is the culmination of all the research that everyone in this department did and presented today, including additional work by others in the department as well. So just, I kind of already talked about questions, but just briefly, we didn't really touch on it thus far, but we did find a decent number, small number, but still very significant number of indigenous artifacts at the site, including projectile points, stone beads, and pottery. Most of this appears to, at present date, to the late Archaic and to the early Woodland period. And it is important to acknowledge that this Montpelier is on Monahoac and presently day Monacan Nation land, and much further research is needed in this area. The original overseer's, principal overseer's dwelling was actually a repurposed structure from Mount Pleasant, which was the external kitchen. Archaeological investigations and previous documentary research suggests that structure burned down around 1790. And that's where our building comes in. This structure, the overseer's house, appears on a map in 1844 and in 1848 when the property changed hands. So at some point in time, and Corey did a great job discussing this, at some point in time, replacing that 1790s structure was a new overseer's house about 200 feet from that original 18th century overseer's building. Metal detector survey helped us pin that down. And then we did, as mentioned before, a number of excavations and surveys to get closer to where we believe the house itself is on the landscape. As folks have talked about thus far, there are two primary, I'm going to speed through some of these, primary concentrations of artifacts at the site. Don't have that slide. There's one, I don't know if y'all can see my mouse over here where you see the 18th century artifacts are, and there's another one, Alex talked about this, off to the west of the structure. And so there are some really interesting patterns when you start to pull together the ceramics, the bone, the bottle glass, and the architectural materials and how they all fit together. The 18th century materials all are clustered on the eastern end of the site where we believe there's an earlier quarter. This continues through the tin glaze, white salt glaze earthenwares. Let me get, I had a cool picture of ceramics. I don't know where that is. And there were some earlier 18th century artifacts, such as this bottle seal. It has the name Beale on it, which the Beales had relationships with the Madisons during the 18th century period as well. The largest cluster of wrought nails are also in this area of the site, so we determined that this is an earlier site, so we didn't end up focusing much time on there. So the bulk of our focus ended up in the center of the site, where we found a number of really interesting features, including trenches, subfloor pit, a borrow pit, and some other possible interesting areas. Just off of the west of the structure, we found some trenches with a lot of burn materials, fire-cracked rock, a lot of stone in situ within that trench. Interestingly, the utilitarian ceramics are clustered in that area, including coarse earthenwares, utilitarian stonewares, and in between that space and where we believe the structure is, or the house, there is the preponderance of tablewares kind of dividing that space. So our current hypothesis is that this could be some kind of detached kitchen or cooking area, but again, much more investigation would be needed in that space there. I'm going to skip through this area of the site. Yeah, here's the slide that shows the two major concentrations. So of those two major concentrations of domestic artifacts, so again, that's including ceramics, glass, bone, small finds, the eastern portion contained the preponderance of 18th century material culture, and the western, here's that ceramic slide I was looking for, and then the western portion contains most of 19th century artifacts, including transferwares, polychrome hand-painted pearlwares, edgewares, mochawares, and the like. When You combine that with our understanding. So basically what this hints at is two possible phases of usage of the area over time as we see the transition from the 18th century and the 19th century. And as previously discussed multiple times, there were a large number of different principal overseers. So this could be indicative of some usage changes with ownership and who's living here. I won't spend too much time on the architecture since Corey really drove this home, but on the eastern gable of this structure, we do think that there was some masonry, predominantly brick, associated with the hearth, but we also found a substantial amount of fired clay or daub, indicating some possible mixed construction or mixed composition. So wattle and daub, log construction, as well as brick, so possible brick hearth or flue. With a log base. Here's just a historic rendition here. So when we got really into the excavation of features and some of the architectural analysis, we have pinned down what we think are two primary phases of the structure. We think there may have been an earlier 16 by 16 foot structure with a central subfloor pit and a gable-ended hearth. The fills of this contained early 19th century ceramics and some really cool, interesting stuff that is still currently being cataloged and will be presented at a future conference in New Orleans next year. On the western half, it does appear, and again, as a reminder, this is where the preponderance of 19th century ceramics were, just off of the western end. We found some different features, predominantly as these trenches, forming what may be another 16 by 16 foot extension to that original structure. Gabby discussed, or someone discussed the trench. Alex discussed the trench that was excavated, and within it is this polychrome hand-painted broad brush-stroked pearlware, which dates around 1830, which suggests a much later fill date. So again, hints at this older, or this newer addition to the structure that did not get, in its use, did not get filled in until post-1830. When it comes to interpreting the architectural makeup of the structure, we did have a good amount of brick, but as Corey pointed out, not enough to signify that it was a full brick structure. So a couple theories were proposed for those trenches, going back to those trenches here, one of which was a formerly contiguous brick foundation that was robbed out. However, we did not find significant inclusions of mortar within that potential trench, robber's trench. So we pretty quickly ruled that out, although it still is a possibility. Another possibility is that the structure had a ground laid sill or a buried sill, such as those found at the smokehouse. It is actually pretty rare to find those on a plowed site. So if that is indeed what these are, we are quite lucky, although there is the possibility that they're just drainage trenches as well. Another piece of evidence that supports this expansion on the western end of the structure is the presence of machine cut nails concentrated on that western end, whereas wrought nails are concentrated on the opposite end of the structure, hinting at two building phases. So this is our kind of hypothesized concept of the structure. I won't get into the borrow pit because there's just not time, but we did find a ton of animal bone within it, which Gabby discussed. And probably what I think is one of the more significant inclusions was several large stones and brick that had lime-based mortar on it, and which does point to that in the demolition of the structure, there is some mixed masonry going on with the structure, whether they're with piers, foundations, or other architectural components that are masonry at the site that we just did not find, possibly due to plowing or later site cleanup. The biggest hint to that site cleanup is the concentration of burned machine cut nails that are all concentrated within the borrow pit. The borrow pit was likely open on the landscape as a trash deposit for the site, again, pointing to all that bone, charred materials, and it's likely that in the final demolition of the structure, whether it burned down by natural causes or was razed to the ground, that pit was likely filled in with whatever rubble was left from the structure, again, as a hypothesis. I won't talk any more about the brick because Corey went over that very, very thoroughly. And again, I'm just breezing through it. So if you all want to read the full paper that goes into nauseam of these features and their cuts and depths and all that, I encourage it. So thank you all so much for listening to all this. I'm going to hand it back over to Matt. I'm going to stop sharing.
All right, thanks, Chris. The final paper in the session was given by Becca Davis and myself, and that focused on the community engagement that we was part of this NEH project. And what has been really important about that is, of course, the Montpelier Descendant Committee and their input on the research and the questions and the direction that we've been heading as a department. And you all are, part of, that constituency as well in terms of being the larger set of community that has given us support, not only for the work that we've been doing, but then of course, discussions we've had, in Zoom sessions like this, and then also in the field about research questions. And this has been a real inspiration for the work that today the MDC is doing on memorialization. And we're going to be, I was just talking with Allison James about potentially doing a lunch and learn on this in the near future, especially the work we're doing on the burial ground. So, but again, as Chris mentioned, it's 1:16. Really appreciate you all in terms of sticking with us on this this longer lunch and learn. And I know there's several questions that have come up. I'm going to look at the chat right now. And looks like most have been just words of encouragement. So thank you all for this. And what I'm going to do is I will send out the recording for this for those of you all that have missed it, but then also put in the links to all the full papers that we've been able to do. And this, what we're excited about with this mini session is these 5-minute papers are great pieces for some of the story maps that we work on. So we're gonna, put these into a future story map that we'll be doing as part of this. So, but thank you all so much for the support, in this lunch and learn, and for the 42 of you all that have been here the entire time. Your love shows. So, but thank you all, and stay in touch. We'll we got some exciting programs coming up that we'll send an email out about, and we'll talk with you all soon. So thanks, everybody. All right. Bye-bye. And everybody's waving goodbye out there. So not to make you all sick. Thanks, everybody. Bye.